Well, hello everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining us here today for our webinar. My name is Dave Bittner. I'm the producer and host of the CyberWire Daily podcast. It is a daily news program all about cybersecurity. Hopefully some of you are familiar with it. If you're not, please do check it out. We think it's a good value for you to keep up on everything cyber. But that's not why we're here today. Today we are here with Barak Shelef from Oasis Security. And we are talking about powering your agentic access, own your non-human identities. It's obviously a very hot topic and something that there's a lot to cover today. And we thank all of you for joining us here. Before we jump in, just a few little housekeeping items. We will be taking your questions throughout the webinar. So if you look at your interface here, there's a little question mark. There's a place where you can enter questions. Please feel free to do that at any point throughout the presentation today. And we will address those questions when we have either a good break in the conversation or certainly towards the end. And then other than that, please enjoy, and we hope you enjoy our presentation today. And again, we thank you for joining us. So let me start out here, Barak, by welcoming you. And before we dig into the specifics, maybe can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, where you got your start, and what led you to where you are today?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. First of all, great to be here and talk about this topic. It's super interesting. I think a lot of people have a lot of questions. I started my journey in cybersecurity over 15 years ago in the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces. And following that, I joined a small startup that turned out to be a very good success in Guardicore in the field of cybersecurity and network segmentation. And 3.5 years ago, I joined our founders here in Oasis Security as a founding engineer. And we've been working on, identity security ever since then, and now really into understanding non-human identities and agentic access and where they fit. And that's been my focus in the past 3 years at least.
Mm. Well, before we dig into AI and the agentic element, can we kind of take the temperature, get a ground level set of where we are when it comes to dealing with identity, protecting identity, those sorts of things? Where do we stand right now?
Right. So I think there's a lot of movement in recent years. The term non-human identity really started becoming a major part of identity programs over the last year or so. But there was a major shift. I think everyone noticed it a few years after cloud adoption has really become a mainstay of both security teams and identity teams. I mean, that's a main focus of pushing technology for many organizations. That really changed the way that we look at identities. The first to get introduced to that new cloud identity type problem was actually human users, our workforce, and our employees and customers and contractors. They were the first that we really needed to address. And a lot of great companies came with amazing products that really revolutionized the way that we manage those identities. But when we started Oasis 3.5 years ago, we really noticed that there's something to be said about non-human identity management. What really drives change today is new technology. And I think AI and agentic adoption is just another great example of how cloud, SaaS, and overall new technologies really drive business for large organizations. And with that expansion, we have a huge influx in not only human identities, but much more so in non-human identities. Those are the service accounts. Those are the keys, the API tokens that actually power our entire technology stack, from applications that we buy and implement or those that we create internally. They're all reliant on that infrastructure of identity access. And non-human identity has been in the forefront of many breaches. Listening to your podcast, almost every other day, I hear about something relevant to that specific topic, service accounts, certificates, keys being mismanaged, mishandled. And that, I think, is the forefront of identity programs now. And, like you said, before we even get into agentic access, which is a whole new different type of beast, non-human identity is right now, I think, the key target for a lot of organizations to try to wrap their head around and produce an effective program to deal with them.
Well, help me understand here. When we say non-human identity, what is the spectrum of things that covers? What does that encompass?
That's a great question, because I think that a lot of people were at first averse to the idea of defining an identity, but by what it is not. But that is the only way that we found it effective, because we know that machine identities, such as certificates, keys, service accounts, whether they are in Active Directory, on premise, in the cloud, in SaaS, they're one type of identity. But then we also know that the same attack vectors and same management issues arise from managing service accounts, which are used as break glass accounts and aren't necessarily tied to one machine or one entity. And the same could also be said to many application identities, which are used together to form a singular identity for an application. Because when I develop an application, I might also have a key to that database or a key to a certain service. So everything from SaaS keys, OAuth tokens, API keys, and service account, passwords, certificates, all of these facilitate communication between non-humans in our network. And those are by default facilitated through non-human identities.
And so, what are the typical challenges that folks face when it comes to securing them?
So I think the first challenge is understanding what's our governance plane. When we talk about human identities, it's really apparent that we're talking about pinning it to the person. So we have a lot of great technologies such as SSO capabilities, and we have multi-factor authentication capabilities. And they're really trying to emphasize the ability to authenticate a person and then tie it back to the governance plane, which says, okay, this is that customer, this is that employee, and we have role-based access control, attribute-based access controls, and those capabilities which deal with authorization afterwards. But that control plane, when you look at non-human identities, essentially breaks down. Why is that? There is no role for an application. It doesn't work for a certain division or a certain part of the organization. It doesn't, join the organization, move, leave. It's an application. And while there's no real meaningful way to do MFA for a machine, there are other more sophisticated ways, because most identity based platforms, such as cloud providers, they give you the ability to cryptographically authenticate your machine. So this is something that we can't do as humans. You can't prove that I am me. So we have, MFA to do with that. But machine identities have different tools. So the first challenge of really addressing non-human identity management challenge is really shifting the focus on what is my control plane. Is understanding, okay, I need to understand what are the workloads. I need to understand what are the identities, and I need to pay much closer attention to how I connect those dots and understanding who are the human owners behind them, what type of access I want to provision, how do I monitor that, and how do I, over time, allow for the critical tasks, which are storing the secrets safely, rotating them, and eventually maybe graduating that technology to a more secure solution, what we call climbing the security ladder towards passwordless solutions or secretless or automatic solutions, using vaults or otherwise. So it's really about, first of all, shifting the way we look at governance and then adopting those new technologies which are more adept for NHI management.
Barak, my sense is that there are a lot of organizations who are really struggling with this today. They're kind of caught between their desire to balance innovation, and we've got this bright shiny object that is AI that's irresistible, right?
Mhm.
But they still need to maintain strong security controls. Is that your experience? That is a approximate struggle for folks these days?
I think that's hitting the nail right on its head. That's what we've struggled with technology adoption throughout the past 10, 15 years around the identity security challenge is really adopting more technology, giving more capabilities for companies essentially to improve their business, improve their products. Um, and at the same time, security teams and identity teams are always the bad guys. They're always the ones trying to force uh, not to change.
The
And
Department of No, right?
yeah, and this is part of the things that we realize also when we developed our product is really we can't be another tool of the bureaucracy. We need to find a way where those two directives of improving the business and improving security go hand in hand. It's not a trivial task. And for every single organization, and I'm serious, I'm talking about every single organization that I worked with, the problem that you stated is exactly what they are facing. And they have two options. One, they are the Department of No, like you mentioned, and then business suffers. Employees suffer, customers suffer. And the other option is they're well, I wouldn't say digging their head in the sand, but they're a lot of times they're telling me we know that there are problems, but because we don't have a program that's able to solve them, we don't have the governance infrastructure to solve them, then we're not even ready to start working on it. So it's
Hmm.
sort of a real difficult problem even to start etching away at it. Need some way to really get that first ball rolling to get the entire piece really moving.
Right, right. And I mean, there's that old chestnut about there's never enough money to do things right, but there's always money to clean up the mess, right?
Mhm.
Afterwards. Let's talk about agentic AI because look, as I mentioned, it is the hot topic. It is something that everybody is at least curious about and perhaps even anxious about. How is this going to affect me? How's this going to affect my organization, my business, my competitors? Um, so how does it well let me even start up at a higher level. When you think agentic AI and how it affects security controls, how is that categorized in your mind? Like what are the first things you think about, the opportunities and the risks?
So I think opportunities are really like it might sound like almost almost stupid, but yeah, the opportunities are really endless. I think what we saw with companies essentially rising from nothing to bring on AI to solve a new novel idea using fairly simple mechanics but very complex models is really mind blowing. So every organization which already has the data, already has the infrastructure, the customer base, their ability to onboard new ideas through adoption of AI should revolutionize. I think we've only seen the tip of the iceberg here, and we'll see many more fields being revolutionized with these new tools and capabilities. So that's for sure. So that's driving our conversation towards okay, but what are the risks, like you've mentioned? So initially, I was skeptical that there's anything new in terms of risk here, um, because we were like, okay, non-human identities, right? You have AI agents. They're are they human? No, of course they're not human. So they're NHIs. But then rises the question, okay, but maybe they're working on behalf of you and me. And this is very common, right? Delegated access to agents is one of the primary use cases of, at least in Oasis, we use ChatGPT to do a lot of work, and it's integrated into our systems through delegated access. And that suddenly really raised what I think is the major question here. If for human access, we have mechanisms to ensure that they are safe, we trust our employees, we have ways to verify that they are diligent and they are smart enough, and we train them to use the systems that they have been trained on. And we trust them. And for non-humans, we have frameworks as well, right? We have software development lifecycle capabilities. We have testing. We have infrastructure to make sure that non-humans behave as they should. And then suddenly, in that intersection, we have this new problem of agents taking actions automatically as if they are non-humans, but using access which we would usually provision to humans through delegated access. And that is suddenly raises the question, what is my accountability model here? That is the primary risk. I have authentication, great. I have authorization, wonderful. But where does accountability come into play when it's not a human and it's not a machine being tested ahead of time? It's almost as if we're running production code without any testing, just sending it out to the world and says, good luck.
Well, and if the notion here is time savings, right? Because presumably the agent can do things way faster than a mere human can. You don't want to have the agent having to check in with the human every time they want to touch something. Hey, is it all right if I go in this folder? Hey, is it all right if I delete this file? So there's some tension there, right?
I think it's even more than tension. We need to understand that there is a technical gap. There were a few examples. I remember reading over the summer a couple of instances where AI agents, even though they seemed to be instructed to do something, they ended up doing something completely different. And that is inherent to the nature of large language models. This is something we won't be able to solve. So if we're talking about giving them any set of, I'm not even talking about keys to the kingdom, I'm talking about, reading my emails, right? So we need to understand what guardrails can we trust here. And you've mentioned the idea of functionality being key here, right? So whatever layer I introduce to serve as the functional guardrail for those large language models, it can't be another check, allow, check. That would essentially create fatigue, alert fatigue, where we're just, yes, sure, do whatever. And then we've missed the point completely. So there's a very delicate balancing act that we need to put here.
Do you feel as though we are at the place where we can approach that problem in a mature way, or are we still kind of feeling our way through the dark, scary forest?
I think reading through some of the releases from a lot of the major contributors, both vendors of software and vendors of AI and large language models, there's huge leaps in that area right now. And people who want to be in the forefront have no other choice. This is what we do here in Oasis Security. We need to adopt that technology and be ready for it as soon as it hits. So, it's hard to say right now how far are we from total clarity about this problem, but this is why we really understood that we need to designate a major part of our engineering towards finding a solution. Part of what we are developing right now is essentially a mechanism that allows you to get back that accountability that was lost through being an intermediate between agents and resources by managing the access control plane, which is the critical plane we need to manage.
So one of our viewers has a really relevant question here they sent in. This is from Ray, who says the adoption of AI-based code creation agents like Cursor, Amazon Q Developer, and Claude to create other agentic AI agents creates a stacked level of security vulnerabilities. Can you expand on this problem? Right? It's the old what was it? It's turtles all the way down. It's agentic agents all the way down. It's an interesting
Mhm.
question.
Yeah, I think first of all, one of the greatest issues that we found, because we're developing agents and we're naturally using a lot of those coding agents, we found that they're still not very good at it, even, which is surprising. They're very good at writing traditional code, but when you start trying to write agents with agents, you start seeing a lot more of those hiccups, and that really emphasizes Ray's concern, because it's, again, how do I trust, companies, third parties you are now trying to onboard to your organization, and they come with this new amazing AI agent they've developed probably within a couple of weeks, coffee fueled, without sleeping, and they produce it and they throw it online and you try to use it, and who's to say that it's not going to accidentally, delete a bunch of data from production because they didn't think to really put in guardrails and it wasn't perfectly implemented, not perfectly tested. So I think what Ray really has his finger on is the fact that if we produce more code, are we producing more quality code? And if agents are developing agents, does that make them more secure or less secure? I think it's rather less secure in most cases.
Right. And how do you verify things? How do you reverse engineer and then get in there to make sure that what's under the hood is what you need, but also safe? That's seems to me
Mhm.
that's a tough challenge these days.
Mhm. I think I think you can't. And I don't mean to be like a downer here, but the idea that we'll be able to control agents by looking at what agents are programmed to do is impossible. You can't go into the model. You can't understand part of the part of the process that is done by that non-deterministic machine, essentially because it's non-deterministic, which is great. I mean, this is the value proposition. What we need is a different layer to give us that accountability back, that level of security back. Um, and some people will say, okay, that's the place of uh, AI security tools, right? So prompt prompt security tools and AI management tools, and they will certainly have a place. But at the end of the day, what's shared across all those systems? That's the identity access layer. So, no, I sound like a broken record, but this is what we came to understand from talking to a lot of organizations, and they're coming to us. They're saying, we understand that the only way we can solve that across our organization is by using identity access management
Hmm.
as the primary tool.
So am I help me understand is the notion then that by having that identity access across the organization, but also applied to however many layers of agents we may be putting at a task, that, for example, by putting restrictions on one area of the business, it gives me the ability to apply that restriction no matter how many agentic layers there are. Is that part of what we're talking about here?
It's a good question. I think you could try to control it that way.
Yeah.
Let me equate it to something um, that we know more about, and that is the question about network segmentation as a method to addressing attack vectors.
Mm.
And this is something we see from all the big vendors, Palo Alto's and Wiz and everyone. They're talking about what's the attack vector over everything, right? So you could ask the same question regarding, okay, so a user in South America sends this prompt and it goes to my AI agent in North America. And then I go to a third party agent in Europe and essentially try to understand how does that ripple effect through the decision-making tree of what access I need to give it. And I think what we found when looking at network challenges is that in most cases, it's a weakest link type situation.
Mm.
And it's not that we don't need the context. It's not like, oh, I'm sitting in my small part of the system and I can control everything from here. That is the old antiquated approach of centralizing identity to a single place and managing everything from them. That is impossible. We have data, we have infrastructure, we have workloads all over the physical planet and the virtual planet, right? So we need a system that goes above everything and allows us to both orchestrate our visibility and our response. So in some cases, a solution might be this is where you need to put better identity controls. This is where your identity is overly permissive. This is where you are giving too much access to a non-deterministic agent. But in other cases, you might need to look at the context end to end across multiple agents and understand how they reflect. This is critical to really addressing those challenges, I think.
I see. Well, thanks to Ray for sending in that question. And just a reminder to everyone out there that we would love to answer your questions. So please don't hesitate to put those in the queue and we will get to them in turn. Barak, going back to sort of a higher level here, when we're talking about non-human identities, they are multiplying fast, right? And people desire them, they need them. Are there any risks that teams tend to underestimate when enabling these non-human identities?
I think one of the risks that people misunderstand is really how that scale will affect their operational teams. Because a lot of organizations that I work with, they have a human identity access program and they've built automations through IGA solutions and IAM solutions. And they're like, yep, give me another identity, give me another user, no problem. But when they start dealing, and this is a lot of times it comes from the IAM team, sometimes from the privileged access team, sometimes from platform teams. And they would essentially say, okay, but now I realize that we're creating hundreds of identities every month or thousands of identities every month. And by the way, when we start looking at our customers' rate of adoption of agentic identities, those being used in tools like Azure AI Foundry and Copilot Studio, those are rising even faster. So we're talking about 100x from human to non-human, and then another 100x from non-human to agentic, simply because it becomes such an easy way to put out automation. We need to really understand how our organization can create an IAM program that can handle that type of load. It's hardly obvious how someone who handled 30,000 employees can now handle 3 million identities. It's not the same formula.
We got another question. This is from Kip, who writes in and says, why do you think that companies are holding off or have held off for so long on taking action against this threat vector?
I'm going to make some CISOs mad when I'm going to say this. But when we come to POVs and to new customers and we show them, a brand new world, really, we show them insights of issues that are 5, 10, 20 years old. We've connected to organizations who have unrotated non-human identities since the 90s in their Active Directory. And up until that point, they were, I wouldn't say blissfully ignorant, but they knew where the bodies were buried and they knew to gently avoid those areas. And honestly, up until recently, it wasn't really a challenge, right? Because we had strong network perimeters. Network perimeter, and I can attest to that from my work in Guardicore and Akamai. Um, Network perimeter was really the go-to a few years ago. That was how you secured your application, your security network, northbound, southbound connections. But now we see that all the attack vectors are going towards, okay, let's go to the cloud, let's go to the SaaS, and let's target those identities. Because I'm not going to, break through some data center firewall hosted by, I don't know, AWS. It's not going to happen. But I will break something when it comes to those identities. So I think, Kip, to answer your question, they could afford to ignore them and delay action for quite a bit of time. Now is the time to take action, because we see CISOs trying to work through some of the major attacks that we heard about in the past few years. And when it comes to response, and Dave, it's exactly what you said, right? When you need to respond to a real threat, then all hands on deck, right? But I remember reading about the incident response in some organizations taking them 3 months of full labor, all the IT team, all the DevOps organization working on rotating tickets, rotating tokens, and rotating keys for 3 whole months. I mean, that's expenses through the roof. So now is the time to be proactive. Now is the time to gain those controls back and maybe address that threat vector, which is right now the most critical, if you ask me.
It sounds like part of what you're describing here is that the access that non-human identities are given. It's kind of like permissions that you'd give people, which are so rarely revoked, right? Somebody says, "I need access to this folder." Someone gives them permission, and how often do you go through and audit the organization to see if that person still needs access to that folder? Is that a fair analogy?
Yeah, and I'll give you a great example. One of our first customers we talked about, and he called this problem you've mentioned. He called it it's the death through 1,000 cuts for a security program. There's this slow creeping death that comes from essentially refocusing an application or rescoping it in some way. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, I've worked quite a bit in DevOps here in Oasis. And it's clear that when we have an issue, the first thing to go, someone would say, "Oh, just give me an admin for like 5 minutes." And I need to go and say, "No, listen, we have privileged access management. We can handle it." But that's our first go-to, right? And who's there to clear that up? So for humans, we have tools, right? We have privilege access management. We have all those facilities to give us elevated permissions for a certain time period. But non-human access, there's very little checks and balances on that part. I mean, there are attestation programs out there, but most of them, from my experience, are check, 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 whatever. I have no idea. I didn't create this identity. I didn't create this application. Some person in my organization did it 3 years ago. He left already. I'm just maintaining it. And you know what I would love not to have is outage, right? So how can I
Right.
ensure there is no outage?
Right.
Don't change anything.
Right. It's another one of those old chestnuts of, hey, we're in the server room with the rack. What does this thing do? I don't know. Unplug it and see who comes running, right? You don't want to be that person.
Yeah. And we in Oasis, we really strive to build a platform that will essentially give identity teams the ability to be a champion and to really push for more technology instead of being, like you mentioned, Department of No. We need to give them the ability to really be champions of a new cause, whether it's adopting new SaaS platforms or new applications, or being the leaders in adopting AI instead of, the amount of questionnaires I need to fill out about what type of AI are we using here? Is this fine? Is this okay? We need to switch that way of thinking towards a way where we're pushing more technology. And I mean, we as identity teams, I put myself in identity team personnel shoes every day. We need to push towards being the enablers. I think that's the key, and this is what we strive to do.
Laura has a question. They write, can IGA simply evolve to include NHIs in its workflows?
So that's an interesting approach, because, like I've mentioned, applications, they aren't joiner, mover, lever, right? That's the terminology we usually use when we're talking about IGA. So right, they're not joiner, mover, lever, but they're somewhat similar. But the key distinction here is that IGA platforms, they rely on understanding the human involved. What can we say about the human that fits the access that they receive, and then to facilitate that action in some cases. But when we're talking about, that's what I mentioned right now, it's what we call the context. So the context of, why does Dave have the permissions to do A, B, C, D, E, F? That's reliant on his directory positioning within the organization, that relies on his attributes, that's all that stuff. That's the context. And IGA tools really do a great job of making that context the source of truth. And when you authenticate, you gain access according to that source of truth. And if you leave the organization, change your role, or when you initially only join, you get that essentially as birthright roles and permissions and everything. So it's very easy. But the context for non-humans is completely different between each and every application. And it's not that the line in the IGA platform should say non-human instead of human. It's the underlying engine that talks about applications and role-based access control and attributes and associating with organizational structure. They simply don't fit. Non-human identities rely on each and every application being directly coupled to certain resources, and that's really dependent on what the developer thought we should do, how this was rolled out, what the SRE teams are managing, what DevOps are utilizing, what tools do we have in production, what we have in staging. So those mechanisms simply don't exist for IGA solutions.
Well, thank you, Laura, for sending in that question. We do appreciate it. I want to ask you about guardrails. I think we can all agree that guardrails are an important thing. But how do you keep guardrails from turning into speed bumps? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it's a question about, it's essentially a question of how can we rapidly adopt, right, any type of guardrail. Because right now, some organizations are, running wild, and that's great for business at least. And I think those organizations are really now trying to figure out, and we are working with them when we're implementing our agentic access management tool. We're working with them to better understand, how does that onboarding process look like? Okay, because we need to find a way where we're not really slowing anyone down, and we're not trying to put those guardrails where people are doing essential work, right, in line with business justification and what they need to do. In those places, we need to think about, okay, what standing access makes sense for this person? What standing access makes sense for that agent? And those don't necessarily align every time, right? I have certain permissions in our privileged, secure platforms, but it's not like I'm going to give an agent direct access to any production DB that I have access to, right? That doesn't make sense. So first of all, we need to understand, where is that golden path? Where's the yellow brick road that leads us to really good AI adoption? and make sure that those guardrails, as they are named, they're to the left and to the right, right? And the way we do that in Oasis in agentic access management is slowly bringing it in from the far left and far right and trying to understand where we see friction and really rolling it out, understanding that right now we need to maintain both operational continuity, we need to still drive business through AI adoption, and we need to make that process of slowly getting good guardrails in place essentially an afterthought. It's something that will happen through our technology instead of people constantly trying to figure out what can it do, what it should do, what it can't do, what it is doing right now. So that's our approach.
Well, as we are increasing the level of autonomy in our organizations, as we're allowing these AI systems or empowering these AI systems to take on more autonomy, if I'm on a security team, how do I maintain my visibility, and how do I maintain my accountability over these sorts of actions?
So first and foremost, you need to understand what are your platforms. You need to understand what is your inventory, what is my ability to analyze the critical logs that are coming from those platforms, correlate them to inventory, and then map them back to ownership. And you could equate ownership of non-human identities as part of our accountability model. And for AI, you need to do the same. You need to be able to see. Let's talk about what is the platform in this model of equity between these two systems. So the platforms could be where I put my resources, could be my data sources. We have customers using a lot of Databricks solution to store a lot of important data that they want to engage with AI tools, which is great. So now you need to understand, how do you connect those identities? And a lot of our customers, they're having a lot of problem there because is it a human accessing data? Is it a machine? Is it the human's agent? So we need that visibility into the inventory. And then finally, they need to ingest all the events coming in from the IDP, from the SSO, from the resources, and fuse them together into a map that says, okay, this is what's actually happening. That is the key pointers you need to take. What's the problem? The problem here is that it's very intensive work, and it really hinders organic growth and adding new technology, because if you want to add a new integration into your system, is the first thing you're thinking about is, okay, how do I maintain inventory ownership and visibility? Definitely not. So you need some solution that can take that burden off of you so you can focus on what really matters, which is business, not security.
We've got another question here from Ray, who says, so in today's AI world, there is more of a need to understand the organization's workflow and roles during the business process design phase, since these policy documentation with form the basis of the rules file for future AIM agentic agents. I think I butchered that a little bit, but do you get the gist of what Ray's asking here?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a huge challenge here is really organizations trying to make those, technical design processes that they have um, fit fit the new way of producing applications using AI. Um, I'm talking both about development and when talking about purchasing. Um, and this really, I talk to a lot of peers of mine who are really on the cutting edge of adopting that technology. And when they look and compare that to how they find a solution to fit some business need, and they look at the internal processes, the standard operating procedures that they have, there's a very big gap there, which they usually fudge in order to just say, okay, yeah, this is what we need. I can't really explain why, um, uh, and that essentially breaks down our ability to really say, okay, someone decided to use this application for this purpose. And I think what Ray is asking here is there a way to tie back from that original process of design a level of policy to implement? Because if we're sitting back and saying, okay, this is the application, this is what we need to solve, is there a way for us to translate that into rules to give back to that agent, say, okay, this was your purpose, this is what you're supposed to do? So I feel from my colleagues and peers is that there's a breakdown there, essentially because we're almost talking about old world, new world. They don't speak the same language. Some of it comes in the form of prompt security, but it's not an alternative. I think that just feeding rules files like we do for our cursor, for instance, is a good way to get it in the right direction. But that's not a guardrail. That's not a way to stay secure. That's a way to optimize performance, which is important. But it's a whole different ballgame when you want rules to be rules. And that's not what LLMs are built to do.
Let's talk about some practical steps here. I mean, if let's say I'm an organization and I am just starting this journey. I'm just starting to modernize my identity security around AI. Where do you recommend I begin?
I think the first thing is to bring in some of those internal customers and really understand what's their day-to-day use. Because what we find is that security teams and IAM teams are solely focused on their monitor, and they're saying, we have our SOC team in place. We know what's happening in the organization, and when we come to them with our end-to-end visibility solution and inventory, we always surprise them with users running AI agents from their laptops using unmanaged keys that they've extracted from CI/CD pipelines, and they're running them locally, essentially misusing both their human identity to essentially do token pass-through, and on the other hand, also misusing non-human identities just because they have them laying around to enable AI. So I think the first part is to understand that you don't know what you don't know. And it's a big part of risk, as always, right? That's how we model risk. And security teams need to be, like we said, the champions of this new era of AI, or at least here in Oasis, that's what we want them to be. So you need to find, the first step is to get that basic visibility and start talking to your customers, your internal customers. Say, okay, what are the AI initiatives? What are we doing? And actually find those people running agents locally, and not, come there with a stick and say, somebody's been a bad boy, but rather say, let's do this properly. Okay, what do you need? Okay, this is my approach when dealing with internal adoption of technology here in Oasis. Is first thing, this is great, whatever you did, like I'm sure it's very important, but let's do it properly. I'm sure it's not malicious. So that's the first step. Get visibility, talk to people, be an enabler.
We have a question from Kevin who says, is just-in-time access a good goal for preparing for agentic AI?
I think that is one of the most critical tools we need to adopt, because I look at the problem as a two-dimensional problem. And when we look at agents trying to access resources, you could look at one dimension, which is least access, right? We always talk about least access. We talk about concepts like zero trust, and we really try to pinpoint what's the smallest box of permissions we can associate to a certain workload, and always assume breach, and all that type of lingo goes into really tightening that box. But I think what Kevin raises here is arguably more interesting. Why? Because when we look at applications, and how they evolve over time, they gradually gain more access, usually for good reason. We add more features, we add more data, and we need to be able to handle that, right? And it comes back to what you said, Davis. Are we building guardrails or are we building speed bumps? So we need to find a way where least access has some value, right? But it's not be all and end all. That's not the critical part of security, if you ask me. In agentic access, just in time access, which is aware of the context, it says, okay, this is what you want to do generally, right? So you want to read my emails, you want to read a company documentation, great. I'll give you access to other company documentation as well, and maybe your emails, and also you might also want to read my calendar invites as well. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's how agents work, right? Most of us who use agents are used to seeing that little circle turn and say, oh, I'll look here as well, and I'll grab more data here. So giving it a bit more lee room, like way to elbow some more permissions, is very useful. But really tightening it into that certain time and space and saying, okay, you want this access for what purpose? For managing my next week's meetings and writing a summary? Perfect. Do that. But next session I have with my prompt, and I'm asking it to do something completely different, like send an email to a customer, right? I don't want it to accidentally leak my internal documentation into that, right? Because that will essentially be a sort of time-based leak from my previous conversation. So this is why I think, Kevin, you're really on to what's really important here. That's not only least access, but almost more importantly, just-in-time access and time-bound access.
All right. Well, we've just got a few more minutes here, but we've got some great questions coming in here. Christian writes, there's a Latin phrase, and apologies, Christian, I never took Latin, so I will do my best. Quis custodiet ipsos custodes, which is who will guard the guards. I think of it as who watches the watchman, if you're a comic book fan. With that said, should we trust companies to police themselves, or should we design an agnostic system more like a certificate of authority type of approach?
I tend to lean towards a more distributed approach, which really leans to some level. We need more, and it's going to be crazy that I say it, but in some areas here, we need a bit tighter regulation, but not because regulation is key here, but rather because regulation is so much behind what we consider the problem, that we need to focus on uh, having someone force the focus on where it actually matters. And I think companies, like I said, they're really emphasized on making business go better, and that in many cases involves getting better experience to users. But we need some level of checks and balances, which is uh, more adapted for these modern challenges. So having some frameworks which are already in place, NIST, PCI DSS, SOX, HIPAA, they need to make sure that they address AI challenges as well. And I'm sure that those are in certain stages already coming, and some of them are more back, some of them are more ahead of their time. But that will serve a role. But more importantly, is the technical community really serves a role here. And this is why I think, Dave, I think your podcast does a lot in order to really, echo all the issues that we know are happening every day around the world. No CISO is blind to the challenges that we have. So I think that's the key, Kristen, to what you raised. We need to bring more awareness, and we need more updated policies.
Well, Christian follows up and says, do you think traditional cryptography or blockchain is still a good solution given quantum tech is right around the corner?
Um, It's interesting because for those of you who are up to date with the recent Nobel Prize in Physics, which was also about some of the great steps that enable quantum computing, I'm really interested in that part of my physics background. But I think there is still a gap there. I think cryptography and that's way above my pay grade, but cryptography professionals are looking at ensuring that next gen of cryptography is safe. Blockchain, especially towards, if we're talking about, and again, this is less my area of expertise, talking about distributed capabilities, safe distributed capabilities um, for this type of security. I think the area is still very young, but it's a great interesting place to look at what is the way to leverage distributed technologies in order to facilitate that type of trust that we lack when we're talking about LLMs. That's a great idea, but not something that I had in mind quite yet. You might be onto something, Christian.
All right, fair enough. Well, in the time we have left, I'd love to kind of point towards the future here. I mean, as you look toward the horizon, where do you think we're headed here? What are we looking towards in both the short and long term when it comes to this stuff?
I think short term, we see vendors really putting in a lot of effort to make their offering more AI available, and organizations need to adopt all those governance tools that we talked about in order uh, to reap those benefits. Because there's so much. Imagine for every single dollar you as a technology professional put in, there are thousand more of vendors and technology professionals putting in much more than that into that technology. So really being in that forefront is this is the time. This is what you need to focus on. How do I adopt that AI capability? Looking farther into the future, we need to understand how non-human identity and human identity and agentic access, which are now, I consider them the holy trinity of identity management, how they fit into a program which is an enabler to success, right? And not a hindrance, not the no department, how organization can leverage that in order for IAM professionals to be champions of new technology, new business. I think that is the key which organizations need to focus on for the next 3, 5, 10 years.
All right. Well, I think that's a terrific place to wind things up. Barak Shelef is Chief Architect Officer at Oasis Security. Barak, thank you so much for taking the time for us. And thanks to everybody out there in the audience for joining us here today. We do appreciate your time. It's my understanding that this will be available as a recording in the future. So if you have any colleagues who you think could benefit from this information, please do share it and help spread the word. On behalf of everyone at Oasis and my team at N2K CyberWire, thank you so much for joining us here today. Again, we value your time and we appreciate you carving out part of your day to be with us here. We hope to see you around next time. Until then, do take care and thank you. So long.